Acts chapter 19, verse 21. While you're turning there, last week we continued with a look at an attempted exorcism. Those trying to use a spell or an incantation to try to remove a demon from another person, which was by human means, not by God's means. And those 7 sons of Sceva that we saw, Sceva was one of the chief priests there in Ephesus, and they tried to use the same type of language that they had heard Paul use, and he had done that through God's power there, but they were trying to use it like it was a spell to cast out a demon from a man. The demon knew Paul, at least to some degree. He completely knew Jesus, a different word there as we saw that there, because Jesus as God, he's accountable to him there. But he does not take orders from men who have no attachment to God whatsoever. And that was the case of those 7 brothers there. They had no authority over that demon. That's when the demon-possessed man actually turns on them, severely injures them. The Greek there describes it as a traumatic injury. So very ugly, probably bloody scene there. Ripped their clothes off, and so they run away humiliated, wounded, and naked. They're exposed as fakes, and God could have allowed this demon to be freed from that man, but in order to expose them as fakes so they wouldn't try to blend in with the Christians, God didn't. He left it there for a while. And so the rest of the people, you remember, they were afraid. Many of them did believe in Jesus. They confessed their sins, showed the things that they'd been practicing, and brought their spell books there. You remember, piled them up there, burned them, 50,000 pieces of silver worth there. They didn't want to sell them. They wanted them gone. That's a true sign of repentance from those new believers. And we close with verse 20 again, which is where the Word of God is growing in this area and prevailing. It's affecting people. So we move into chapter 19, verse 21. We're going to see a riot break out in Ephesus here. And we're going to read all the way down through verse 41 through the end of the chapter. And it's more of a narrative, but we see a lot of details from that. Acts 19:21 says, "After these things were ended, Paul purposed in the Spirit when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia to go to Jerusalem, saying, After I have been there, I must also see Rome. So he sent into Macedonia 2 of them that ministered unto him, Timotheus and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for a season. And the same time there arose no small stir about that way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines for Diana, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation, and said, Sirs, ye know that by this craft we have our wealth. Moreover, ye see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods which are made with hands. So that not only this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worshipeth. And when they heard these things, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. And the whole city was filled with confusion, and having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. And when Paul would have entered in unto the people, the disciples suffered him not. And certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring him that he would not adventure himself into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing, and some another, for the assembly was confused, and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander beckoned with the hand, and would have made his defense unto the people. But when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one voice, about the space of 2 hours, cried out, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. And when the town clerk had appeased the people, he said, Ye men of Ephesus, What man is there that knoweth not how that the city of the Ephesians is a worshipper of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Jupiter? Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against, ye ought to be quiet, and to do nothing rashly. For ye have brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches, nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. Wherefore, if Demetrius and the craftsmen which are with him have a matter against any man, the law is open, and there are deputies, let them implead one another. But if ye inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. For we are in danger to be called in question for this day's uproar, there being no cause whereby we may give an account of this concourse. And when he had thus spoken, he dismissed the assembly. Now, I hope we've been able to see so far throughout the book of the Acts that the church is most effective when it goes through persecution. When it goes through persecution, you can see Satan is trying to fight something that's working. It's being effective there. And when we confront the world boldly with the gospel of Jesus Christ, there's going to be some backlash sometimes. There's going to be some persecution that follows, but that's also how people are changed. It's how people get saved. That has to happen for the Holy Spirit to convict them. They're fighting the Holy Spirit. They're not fighting us. But it's directed at us because that's the person they can see. But when people are pulled away from false religion, there's going to be some resistance also. And we see that in this instance, it's over the money. We've seen that with the Judaizers in the temple and the synagogue. You remember the Jews are controlling the temple worship there. And during Jesus' time, and even in the apostles, they're losing followers. Now, we see thousands of people getting saved on Pentecost and those type of things. When you compare that to the total number of Jews, it's not a huge portion of them at all. But it is enough that they're going to notice that. And so that's what they're fighting there. The temple, they were making a lot of money at the temple. The Jews were, those that were running that. And they were wealthy. The Sadducees are in charge of that. That is the elite group. They're the wealthy people of the Jews there. They're in charge of that. Others serving under them. And we've talked about multiple times how they brought the sacrifices in there, sold them at a huge profit, did the same thing with money changers, and that was for money. And so we also saw back in Acts chapter 16, you don't have to turn back there, but in Acts 16, where a woman has a demon cast out of her, and her masters were very angry about that because she was their meal ticket there. She was working for them. And so we see the same thing today in false religion. It's about the money. You can trace it down to the money. And so that's the same thing that's going on in Ephesus here. And so it's just another link in the chain of a long list of false religions and their attachment to covetousness and the love of money and those type of things. And so in Acts 19 verse 21, he says, after these things were ended, Paul purposed in the Spirit when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. Now, Paul's making plans here. That's what he's doing in that verse. We can see this purpose is in the Spirit. Now, that's not in the Holy Spirit. Now, we talked about that before, right? Sometimes it is the Holy Spirit that it's referring to. Sometimes it's the spirit of man. And so this is his own spirit. He has purposed in his own spirit, right? And how do we know that? Because in verse 22 he says, so he sent into Macedonia two of them that ministered unto him, Timotheus and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for a season. He wanted to go to those places, continue on and go directly to Jerusalem, but God won't let him go yet. He goes ahead and sends a couple ahead of him, and he wants to go, of course, at a later time. But he wants to go to Macedonia and Achaia. I'll put this map up here, but I'll put it on the screen there. And just so we're familiar here, if I can get our pointer working. There's Ephesus right there. He wants to go up here into Macedonia in this area. and then go down to Achaia, which is down here in the tip of Greece there. And so that's where he wants to go. And then he wants to go to Jerusalem, and then back to Rome, and so on. And so he's making these plans here. But the good thing is, and it's okay to make plans. It is. It's okay. And we talked about, when we were talking about Peter earlier in this book, how he's going and he's doing and he's going. And it's easy for God to steer him as long as he's going forward all the time. It's hard to steer a boat that's sitting still. It's impossible. You can't. It has to be moving. And so that's the way Peter was. Paul's doing the same kind of thing. And that's okay as long as you realize, well, I'm making plans, but these don't line up with God's plans, and you change to God's plans. That's okay. And Paul, we've seen Paul do that, and he's continuing to do that, and this is an example of that. And so he's not going to go ahead and go now without God's direction. And so he stays behind there. But just like the other places that he's been, he wants to go back to them, back to those churches that he's been to before, churches that he's helped start. He wants to strengthen them in the Lord there and help them evangelize more people as well. And so that's Paul's pattern. That's the way he always does things. He gets things started. He stays as long as God will allow him to stay. And then when he has to leave, he doesn't just abandon them forever and say, well, lots of luck, I'm going to be praying for you. No, he does whatever he can to get back to them and to help teach them some more things. When he can't get back to them, sometimes he sends other people to go back and do that for them. We've seen that with Timothy and different ones where he sends them Silas. And sometimes neither of those things are possible, and he writes them a letter. And so, but he does whatever he can to help strengthen the saints there. And so, but here, the saints in Jerusalem are struggling with poverty. And Paul is going to collect an offering from these other churches there. That's what he's doing. He's collecting an offering and wants to take that to the church at Jerusalem. If you look over in Romans chapter 15 and verse 25, you see this discussed, and he's talking about the same events that are happening here in Acts chapter 19. In Romans 15, 25 and 26, he says, "But now I go unto Jerusalem to minister unto the saints, for it hath pleased them of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are at Jerusalem." And so that's what he's been doing. He's been collecting that love offering there for that purpose there. And so the body of believers is supposed to support the rest of the body. That's not just our own church. That's other Christians that we know that have needs, and we understand that. We've done that in multiple ways here. We've got them in our bulletin. The Shoes That Fit program is not a ministry of our church. Right? We're participating in that through another church. And so, in praise of the Lord, we're hoping that God blesses that ministry. We see the same thing with the Operation Christmas Child shoeboxes. Somebody else heads that up. Multiple churches participate in that and contribute, and then it has a bigger effect that way. And it can do a lot more. We'll talk some more about that next time, but Paul wants to do this for the saints in Jerusalem there. And if you look ahead in Acts 21 and verse 17, you see that he does actually get to do it. God does allow him that, even though it's not in Paul's timing. God does allow that to happen. Acts 21:17, "And when we were come to Jerusalem, the brethren received us gladly." And so he does make it there. He does get to deliver this gift from these different churches there. And so, but back in verse 21 of Acts 19, we see that Paul also wants to go to Rome. And we talked about there's already a church there. Paul hasn't been there yet. Paul didn't start the church in Rome. And we talked about Aquila and Priscilla. When they meet him there for the first time, they're believers. They're already believers. They came from Rome. The Jews were expelled out of Rome. Caesar says, no, get them out of Rome. We don't want them here. And they have to leave. And so that's how they end up meeting Paul there. And so they were likely saved there. But he does want to help strengthen them, the believers in Rome there, help spread the gospel there. And same thing has happened here at Ephesus. When he strengthened the believers here, then it has spread out to all these different places there in Asia Minor. And it's just bursting there. And so if he gets to go to Rome, he'll be done, right? Well, no. He is always planning more, planning ahead. Romans 15:24, he says, "Whensoever I take my journey into Spain, I will come to you, for I trust to see you in my journey and to be brought on my way thitherward by you, if first I be somewhat filled with your company." And so Paul says, when I get to Rome, then I want to go on into Spain. He wants to go on further out there. And so he's planned all of these things. And Romans 1 and verse 13 says this. He says, "Now I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was let hitherto, that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles." Paul says, I wanted to come to Rome multiple times. But what happened? God wouldn't let him yet. God wouldn't let him yet. And so it doesn't always go the way that he wants it to go, but the planning part's okay. Like I said, as long as he allows God to correct his course. It's okay for him to try to get off, as long as God corrects him and he comes back and says, "Well, no, I'm going to go my own way. I already made up my mind." No, he doesn't do that. He doesn't. And so that's a good plan. Back in Acts 19:22, he says, "So he sent into Macedonia 2 of them that ministered unto him, Timotheus and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for a season." Now, Paul stays in Asia Minor. That's where Ephesus is there. This is Asia Minor, this area through here. And so he stays there, and he sends Timothy, that's Timotheus, and Erastus ahead. Now, we know a lot about Timothy and his mother and grandmother, and they're from Lystra over here in Galatia there, when Paul went through that area there, and how Timothy picks up with him on his second missionary journey and travels with him, and a young believer at that time. But we know a lot about him. Erastus is a bit of a mystery. You can look at Romans 16:23. Paul mentions an Erastus who becomes like a chamberlain in the city of Corinth in Romans 16:23, and he stayed there according to 2 Timothy 4:20. But we can't be sure that's the same person. It's the same name, but we're not sure if that's the same person that Paul's talking about here. At any rate, they're sent, and Paul stays behind in Ephesus. And when he writes the first letter to the Corinthian church, he's writing it from Ephesus. This is where he's at when he does that. And he says this in 1 Corinthians 16. This is the plan. 1 Corinthians 16, 8-10. He says, "But I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost. For a great door and effectual is open unto me, and there are many adversaries. Now if Timotheus come, see that he may be with you without fear, for he worketh the work of the Lord, as I also do." And so Paul says there's still opportunities in Ephesus. God won't let me leave yet. And so he stays there for a while. He also says there in verse 9, I like that, many adversaries. And that's the account we're reading here in Acts chapter 9. Then there's a whole riot full of adversaries that have gotten stirred up there in Ephesus there. But he mentions that Timothy, who originally goes to Macedonia, might come down to Achaia also. And so he gives them some instructions on how to treat him. Now back in Acts 19, what causes this riot in Acts 19:21? Well, obviously from verse 20, the word of God's prevailing, so Satan wants to try to stop that if he can, stop that ministry, and that's the underlying cause. But Paul is trying to help these people in Ephesus. And he's not doing it in a harsh way. He's not doing it in a condemning way. He's trying to love them and share truth with them. He's sacrificing great chunks of time to do that. And we've talked about that so far. He started in the synagogue there, and then he has a makeshift church building where they're either renting or using the the building that belongs to Tyrannus, who had a school there, and also he's going from house to house. And so, he's sacrificing of himself. He's giving of himself. He's demonstrating love in that way. And so how can Satan get those people to turn against a person like that? Now, it's easy if somebody's a hateful, nasty person and they're unkind and they're just, self-seeking and all. It's easy for Satan to turn people against those kind of people. That kind of comes natural to us in our sin nature. But how do you get people to turn against somebody that's acting the way Paul is toward these people? And I believe he's appealing to a greater desire. A greater desire. And, the same thing for Christians. Satan does that with Christians also. And so, we know that there are husbands and wives that loved their spouses, but had affairs too. And you say, well, how can a person who loves their spouse have an affair? How could they cheat on them? Because in a moment of weakness, they had a greater desire at that moment in time. And Satan preys on them. And they weren't prepared for that. They weren't guarding it. They weren't fleeing fornication. And so when he offers that greater desire, they fall into that. Same thing could be said, a moment of weakness, right? The greater desire sometimes could be sleep. I have that moment of weakness all the time. I love to sleep. I've told you, I never want to get out of bed. I don't care if I've slept 2 hours, 10 hours, 14 hours. Doesn't matter. I have slept 14 hours straight. I don't care. I still don't want to get up. But sometimes that greater desire is sleep, and so more than anything else, you just don't want to get out of bed, whether that's for church or a nap to come back to church, something like that. And so the greater desire could be anything. It could be money, it could be entertainment, it could be pleasure, it could be family, it could be other responsibilities, but Satan offers a greater desire at that moment in time. And he knows how to push our buttons, doesn't he? He does. He knows exactly how to do that. So we have to be on guard against those things all the time. In Acts 19, verse 23, it says, "In the same time there arose no small stir about that way." Now that way is talking about Christianity, the way, the narrow road that Jesus describes there. And so there's no small stir. Now I like that. I like that. This is a huge uproar. This is not a little old scene here. It's a riot. That's how we describe it. In verse 24 and 25, he says, "For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines for Diana, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation, and said, Sirs, ye know that by this craft we have our wealth." Now, they had trade guilds at that time, which are different groups of tradesmen, and similar kind of like maybe unions today, where you've got people with the same trade and they work in that trade, and those are designed to protect those in those trades. And so this is that guy. He's kind of affiliated with this trade guild of silversmiths there. And so he speaks up on behalf of all those silversmiths there. And he's trying to shake these men into action. He's trying to get them to... They just don't seem upset enough about what's going on with Paul and the little shrines and things that they're making, and how those things are contrary to each other, and it's going to have an effect on them. And so he's trying to get them all stirred up about this. And he says, this is about our livelihood. Right? That's the greater desire that he's appealing to. Their ability to earn money, provide for their families, take care of their needs, buy things they want. They have wealth, right? So it's not like they're barely getting by. But the rich want to get what? Richer. And so that's the idea here. And so they are profiting from false religion. And so if these people get converted to Christianity, it's going to hurt them financially there. You see another mention, just for fun, you can look over at 3 John. 3 John chapter 1 and verse 12. Once again, this is like Erastus. We don't know if it's the same person or not, but we get another Demetrius here. mentioned in 3 John 1:12. And when John writes this, he says, Demetrius hath good report of all men and of the truth itself. Yea, and we also bear record, and ye know that our record is true. So if that's the same Demetrius from back in Acts chapter 19, we know he got saved at some point. That's what John's describing from this man. If that's the same person, we don't know. But we know one thing for sure in Acts chapter 19. He's not saved. Has no desire for it at this point in time. The temple to the goddess Diana, or Artemis, that's the same person there. That's a huge temple. Now you can get some conflicting information, but I'm going to give you the closest guess I can find about how big this was. About 377 feet long. That's a football field and a third. If you got a track around your football field, that's probably from the edge of the track to the edge of the track. That's a big, long building there. And it would be 200 feet wide. Has 127 columns. Great big, huge, massive columns around this thing supporting it. It housed priests, priestesses, temple prostitutes, tourists came there. You had worshipers, elegant sculptures, pieces of art, those type of things all included in there. Massive amounts of silver and gold decorated it and contained in it. And so it is a spectacle. It is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. If you ever heard that term, there are 7 wonders of the world and then 7 wonders of the ancient world. It's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And just to kind of put this into perspective, how magnificent this building was to see. I read this Philo of Byzantium wrote this. He says, I have seen the walls and hanging gardens of ancient Babylon. That's one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world too. He said the statue of Olympian Zeus. That's another one. The Colossus of Rhodes. That's a third. The mighty work of the high pyramids. That's another one. And the tomb of Mausolus. He says, I've seen all of those. Now, he says, but when I saw the temple at Ephesus rising to the clouds, all these other wonders were put in the shade. It's that much better than those other ones. That's how he describes it. So this place obviously drew a lot of tourists. Now tourism is good for business if you make little silver shrines to sell, and it's kind of like going to New York or someplace like that. They sell them little figurines of Empire State Buildings and stuff from New York. That's what they have, and so that's the same kind of thing here when these tourists come. And we understand that people who depend on tourism have to have tourists come. I think it was the Hawaiian fires. Was that the one where they had the fires on one of those islands, and it was just causing all kinds of havoc and destruction, and people have died, and it's a mess down there. And somebody got on, I think it was social media or something like that, and said, please don't try to come here. And somebody from the islands said, yes, come here, because Hawaii depends on what? Tourists. Right? They were thinking that was going to do a good thing, let these people get their lives back together, and they said, no, if we wait till I get our lives back together, we won't have no life here because we won't be able to support ourselves. And so it was kind of a touchy situation. Some meant well and were trying to do the right thing, but people that depend on tourism, they got to have tourists there. And that was the idea at Ephesus, and if they don't have that, it's going to get pretty hard for them. So what they're saying here is if these Christians shut down the temple worship at Diana, then these men will lose their jobs. That's what they depend on, bringing people in with tourism, buying their stuff. And so, we understand it's far better to lose a job than to lose one's own soul for eternity. But they don't understand that at this time. All they can see is their own self-interest there. And so they're going to fight for it. The city of Ephesus also hosted the Artemisian Games. Now that's after Artemis, the other name for Diana. That was the games dedicated in her honor there. And that happened in the month of May, and that drew even larger crowds to the city. And so some believe that what's happening here in Acts chapter 19 may be around the time of these games, and we'll see that in a minute, because one of the people who's associated with those games is mentioned in these following verses. But we understand that. We see this kind of thing all the time. People come to a strange town for a sporting event or the Olympics or anything like that, and they start partying and drinking, and they kind of get swept up in the excitement of everything, and then they do something stupid. I mean, they just tear up stuff, and you can't imagine what people will do. And just destructive, just for no reason at all. They just get all hyped up on something and just start tearing stuff up. And it's craziness, and it's hard to contain. They just get overwhelmed with that. And that's what's happening here in Ephesus. They just get swept up in the excitement of all this. Look back in Acts 19:25 through 27, he says, when he called together with the workmen of like occupation and said, Sirs, ye know that by this craft we have our wealth. Moreover, ye see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods which are made with hands. So that not only this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worshipeth. And so what he's saying is, it's not just here. They're spreading this nonsense all throughout Asia Minor, right? Where do the tourists come from to see this temple? All over Asia Minor, right? What he's saying is the same thing's happening here. It's happening in other places. If we don't stop it, right, it's going to get worse there. The tourists are going to stop coming. That's what he's saying there. It's interesting that even the pagans are admitting here that the church has been effective at spreading the gospel to the world. He said, oh, they've got it almost everywhere in Asia now. I like that there. And so the Christians, though, here at Ephesus, they didn't protest the temple of Diana. Now that's common. We see that a lot. You know, when a certain group doesn't agree with something else, they protest and they get out there and they shake signs and do all kinds of nonsensical stuff to some degree there. But they didn't do that. They didn't picket this place or try to block the entrance to the temple. They didn't yell at those going in and out. They didn't do anything like that. And so they didn't do those things so people would know they were against it. How did they let people know they were against the worship of Diana at this temple here? Well, their life showed that they were against it. They didn't have to go out there and do those type of things. Now, we see people involved in protests and demonstrations, and they take that kind of approach, and they go out there and shake hands and yell at people and do all that kind of stuff. And no matter if they're right or wrong, what they're standing for, what do most people associate those people with when they act like that? What? Crazies. I put nut bars, crazies, extremists. You can put any kind of name on that. But that's what they associate. When they get out there and act crazy, even though they've got the right message, people still associate them with crazy. And so the message becomes less effective that way. Right? And so they didn't do that. We'd be better served making our voice heard through evangelism, just sharing the gospel with people, than going out and looking crazy. Now, I'm not saying that having your voice heard isn't important, because it is. But we have to be careful how we do that, or the people that we're associated with who are doing that. You may go out to make your voice heard and be perfectly sensible and reasonable, but you're standing in a crowd of crazies. Guess what? You're one of the crazies, right? Just admit it. That's what's happened. You've got drawn in. And so that's what's happening here in Ephesus. Some of these people are just crazy. The other people have got drawn in by the crazy. And so they're now a part of it, whether they want to be or not. But, this man gives some valid points, at least for the silversmiths, because their craft or their trade, if they're going to sell these little trinkets to this fake god, that could be in danger, right? But Mark 8:36 says, "For what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Right? They can't see that. Luke 16:13, "No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." Can't serve God and money. It can't be that way. And so he's appealing to that, their love of money. Satan's also appealing to their sense of pride. The temple of Diana, this is a showpiece for the city of Ephesus. It really is. It's a spectacular sight. They spent, including the construction and the beautification of it, just embellishing it and doing all of that, 220 years. 220 years finishing all of it, getting all of the extra things. And like I say, it was built and then they just kind of beautified it all the time and made it better all the time. And so it's their claim to fame. This is what they're known for in Ephesus, is this temple to Diana. Now, what's our claim to fame? What's our claim to fame? Well, for some people, it's their home. We were talking about some people's homes, and I don't care for them. They're big, but I didn't care for some of them that we've seen. They're just big and ugly, in my opinion. But that's okay. They probably think the same thing about my house, just smaller and ugly. but I don't care about that. Other people, their pride and joy, their claim to fame is their vehicles. Some people have some really nice cars or trucks, or I see some things out on the road sometimes, and I thought, what kind of job you got? There's some amazing things. Some people, it's their trade. They've got job skills that are very valuable, and that's their claim to fame. I heard somebody talking about there before church. Somebody works daylight to dark. They just work all the time. That's their claim to fame, isn't it? That's what they're known for, right? And so that could be it. Some, it's their money. Some, it's their relatives. Some have famous relatives. Some don't have anybody famous, but their grandkid or kid plays on a sports team or something like that, and they stand up in the crowd and say, "That's my kid, that's my boy, that's my grandkid." And they want everybody to know that one belongs to me, so I can get some fame out of it. I can get some, that's ridiculous, but they do that. But some people, believe it or not, their claim to fame is their sports team. They don't play on the team. They've got no responsibility for coaching, training, anything like that. But if their team wins, that's my team. That's my Reds, or that's my Tigers, or whoever it is. I don't know anybody that would claim the Reds, but anyway, that's how they do. Some, it's their claim to fame is their hobby. Now, I know people that would rather fish than eat. I don't know any in this room, but I know some that would rather do that. They would rather fish than eat. I heard one man, now some of you know this guy, so don't say anything, but I heard one man's wife say that he'll miss her funeral if it's on a cornhole night. I've heard him say that more than once. That his wife said if she dies and it's a cornhole night, he won't be there. he'll be at cornhole, right? And that's his claim to fame. Your claim to fame is what people know you for, what they remember you for. Who should that be for a child of God? It should be God. It should be. If people mention our name and the next sentence isn't, they're faithful to church, or they love the Lord, or they do this, or they do something about God. What does that mean? It's not the right priority, right? It's okay to like hobbies and your job and your grandkids' sports and all those kind of things. It's okay to have those kind of things, as long as the priority's in the right order. Right? God first, everything else is under that. And so here, their claim to fame is their temple. Now, if their temple is despised, they'll have nothing to bring in the crowds. Right? Nothing to gain attention. Right? The Artemision games, those are all centered around the temple worship and the goddess there. The temple itself, that's another thing that draws them in. If they didn't have those things in Ephesus, it wouldn't stand out from any place else in Asia Minor. Right? Just, it's just a place. There's nothing special about it. They'll be ordinary and maybe unemployed if you're one of these making the trinkets to sell. And so those are some things that are causing this, right? But you see some things in verse 28, some characteristics, Acts 19:28. Some characteristics of a riot. And we'll recognize these things because they still happen in riots today. But he says, and when they heard these sayings, they were full of what? Wrath, and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. Don't people in riots get mad? Don't they yell and scream and do all kinds of things like that? Of course they do. They are full of wrath here. They're bursting with anger and they start yelling. Right? They are crying out to their goddess. Now notice this. You got a study Bible, you'll see this. The word is in italics, which means what? It's not in the original language. The original language literally reads, Great Diana of the Ephesians. Now you see these people, they're mad about these people coming in, preaching Christianity, preaching about God. There aren't gods made by hands, all these things, and they're preaching against false worship, false gods. They're preaching against that. And so they get so mad about it, right? They're not yelling at those people. They're yelling to who? Their goddess. They're saying, Great Diana of the Ephesians. They're crying out to her. That's what they're doing. They're not chanting Go Reds or Go Bengals or whoever it is. No, it's not that kind of chant. It's like a cry out to her to do something. Right? They're saying, we've built this temple, this very elaborate temple for you. We've made you famous to the whole world. Right? They've stacked their lives on their livelihood on her. And now they're saying, okay, we've dedicated ourselves to you. Do something. Right? Do something. They're crying out to her. Doesn't that kind of remind you of the prophets of Baal when they had that little showdown with Elijah? You remember? Elijah says, well, there's a whole bunch of you. Why don't you guys go first? You remember what they did? They're crying out for hours to Baal. Right, crying out. When that doesn't work, you remember Elijah says, well, maybe you need to yell a little bit louder. Maybe he's sleeping or maybe he's on a journey or something like that. Maybe starts making fun of them. Remember, they start getting up there and they're cutting themselves with knives and the blood's rushing out and just crazy things. But they were crying out to their God to do something. And no answer. Same thing here in Ephesus. They're crying out to their goddess, Diana, no answer. Anger is typical in a riot. And sometimes it gets so out of control, even those on the same side, you've seen those things where they get all the people on the same side, they end up stampeding people on their own side. The people that were in agreement with them end up hurting each other. But usually it's directed at the other people, the opposition, the ones they were fighting against. Stephen's one example. We won't read that for the sake of time, but in Acts chapter 7, Stephen's sharing the gospel there. Those people got so enraged, just grinding their teeth. They just so mad and couldn't hold it in. You remember they ran at Stephen, right? And somebody suggests, let's end this here. Now, I believe that was Saul. I believe that was Paul that made that suggestion, because they lay their clothes down at his feet and they stoned him to death there. And so people do get mad at those sharing the gospel, especially when it affects them. The Jews were so jealous of Jesus, they incited a riot, didn't it? That's what happened in Jerusalem. They incited a riot against Jesus, and then they got them all stirred up, got them mad, got them screaming out, and they started crying out what? Crucify him. Crucify him. That's an angry mob, an angry riot that happened there. Here in Acts 19:29, and the whole city was filled with confusion, and having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed in with one accord into the theater. The confusion of a mob is intentional. Mobs, riots, they get angry, but confusion is on purpose. That's not an accidental event there. They don't want them to have all the information. They don't want them to weigh both sides and make a rational decision about what to do. They want them to act out of an emotional response, out of anger. Why do they want an emotional response instead of a rational response? People are more destructive, are they not, when they act out of anger, out of rage, than if they make a rational decision. And so that's what they want to happen. Most of these people in this crowd are not silversmiths. They don't make little statues or little shrines to Diana. That's not their trade. They do something else. And so in order for these men that make those things to get everybody stirred up, they've got to keep them confused. Just get them excited, get them mad, get them doing something, and they don't really know what they're doing. And so that's what's happening here. They're stirring them up in confusion. They grab a couple of Paul's companions, traveling partners there from Macedonia, the Gaius and Aristarchus, and drag them into the theater. In Acts 20, verse 4, Gaius is from Derbe, which is a region in Galatia, right about there. That's where he's from, not too far from Paul's hometown of Tarsus. And so he's from there in Acts 20 and verse 4. And there it says, and there accompanied him into Asia Sopater of Berea and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus. And so Aristarchus is from Thessalonica, which is a region of Macedonia up here. And then Gaius is from Derbe there. And so they drag them into the theater. Now, when we think about a theater, don't think of something like Paramount Art Center. To me, that's a theater. You go up to the Paramount Art Center, I don't know exactly, I tried to get a count, but it's somewhere about 1,400 people, something like that's how many the Paramount holds up there. And so, the movie theater up there, that's another theater. They hold a lot less than that in the movie theater. That is not this kind of theater. That is not what's happening. This theater in Ephesus would easily hold over 30,000 people. Now, I'm not saying 30,000 people drug them in there, but a big crowd could have gathered in the theater there. A lot of them could have been involved. And so in Acts 19, verse 30, it says, and when Paul would have entered in unto the people, the disciples suffered him not. Now, Paul finds out what happened. He wants to go in. He wants to be involved in this. He wants to defend those people there who've been drugged in there. But if he does that, what will happen? It'll excite him even more, won't it? It'll stir them up even more. Paul is the one that they're targeting. They just couldn't happen to find him at the moment, and they say, oh, well, these two guys were with him. They're responsible for it too. And they grab him. And so what will happen, the disciples say, if you go in there, it'll get worse than it even is now. And so they refrain him. I heard that somebody say this a week or so ago. I was listening to one of those podcasts. He says, it's faith to be in danger and trust God to protect you. But it's presumption to put yourself in danger and then expect God to protect you. There's a big difference if you get in a dangerous situation and you trust God. That's faith. But if you put yourself in the dangerous position and say, well, I think God's going to take me out of it anyway, that's presumption. Jesus wouldn't do that. You remember Satan says, oh, I know God's going to protect you. Just jump off the top of the temple there and God will catch you. The angels will catch you. He won't let you stub your toe, right? And Jesus said, no, I'm not going to do that. That would be presumptuous. That's not faith. There's difference in those two there. In Acts 19:31, he says, "And certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring him that he would not adventure himself into the theater." Now, this is one of the reasons why they think maybe that this may be in the month of May when they had those Artemision games, because these are the people that would officiate over those games there. These are political people. They're associated with Rome there. They're friends of Paul's. Right? They advised him the same thing. Don't go in. Their official title is Asiarches, and these would be in charge of the public games. Those were the people that officiated those games. And so if this is in May, like some have suggested when those games were going on, there are going to be a lot more people in Ephesus than there normally are. And so you can see how they could get a lot of people gathered in this theater in a short period of time there. And these are strangers there. They don't have any vested interest, but they get all excited and everybody's mad, and so they just kind of jump on the bandwagon. That could easily get out of hand there. But their protection of Paul, those who would officiate over those games, that's because he's a Roman citizen. They're not trying to defend him as a Christian. It's because he's a Roman citizen. And to keep the peace in this place. In Acts 19:32, "Some therefore cried one thing and some another, for the assembly was confused, and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together." They're yelling different things. They're all mad about something, but they don't even know what they're supposed to be mad about. Some are yelling one thing, some are yelling something else, and it says the more part knew not. The majority of them don't even know why they're there. They don't know why they're there. And so they just got swept up in the emotion of it all. Verse 33 and 34, he says, "Then they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward, and Alexander beckoned with the hand, and would have made his defense unto the people. But when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one voice, about the space of 2 hours, cried out, Great is Diana of the Ephesians." And so the mob's kind of closed-minded at this point. To keep Alexander from talking, they kind of shove him up there and say something, do something, right? And they shove him up there. He's a Jew when they find out. To keep him from even talking, they keep yelling, "Great Diana of the Ephesians." Same thing. The is missing in the original text, but they're yelling that 2 hours straight. Every time you can imagine, every time they start to die down a little bit and he gets ready to talk, then they just stir it right back up again and just keep yelling. Verse 35 and 36, he says, "And when the town clerk had appeased the people, he said, Ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not how that the city of the Ephesians is a worshipper of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Jupiter? Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against, ye ought to be quiet and to do nothing rashly." Now, we've seen the cause of this riot. These few silversmiths stir up people, get them all mad, get them confused, get them in there, drag a couple of companions in there and stir it all up. And we've seen that the characteristics where they're mad and confused and all that. And now they're going to try to calm the riot down. It's a lot easier to get people worked up into a frenzy than it is to get them calmed back down. Some of you guys are mail carriers. You know what I'm talking about. Sometimes people just get worked up and over crazy stuff, and it's hard to get them back on the right page. But this man here is described as a town clerk. Now, this is a person who keeps official records for the town. That's what he does. He's a writer, right? Which means he'll have to document the things that go on in the town. He'll have to keep records of that. He'll have to write them down. Now, Ephesus is a free city. A free city, Athens was one of those. We talked about some others. And free cities have special rights given them by the Roman Empire. And as long as they can maintain the people's allegiance to Rome and Caesar, as long as they can do that, as long as they can keep collecting taxes there for themselves, right? They're self-funded. They collect taxes. They don't have to receive support from the Roman government. That's one of the privileges there. And so as long as they can continue to fund themselves and keep the peace, the Pax Romana, the great Roman peace there, as long as they can do that, they can continue to be a free city. But if they can't do those things, and here we see, they're not keeping the peace. This has gotten out of hand very quickly there. And he says, we're in danger here. This guy steps up, and they believe that the statue of Diana fell down from the heavens, from Jupiter there. That was probably a meteorite. That's probably, if you've ever seen the statue, you can tell it's pretty grotesque looking, and so probably just a crazy looking meteorite that fell. But that's what they believe, and they say, well, we know that the statue fell down from the heavens, and we know that if we know that's true, then how could they speak against her? She's a goddess. These are just mortal men. If you believe that to be true, why does she need us to defend her against these people? Right? She's a god. These are just men there. And said it's best to just be quiet and do nothing rashly. There in verse 37 he says, for you have brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches, nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. Paul and his companions haven't robbed the temple or any of those other places of false religion. They haven't openly protested or blasphemed their goddess Diana. Right? They've just shared the truth about God. And now this man's testifying to their character. Right? They haven't done anything illegal. They haven't done anything disorderly. Unlike you all, who've started this riot and got all these people worked up into a frenzy and had an unlawful assembly there. And he says this in verse 38. Wherefore, if Demetrius and the craftsmen which are with him have a matter against any man, the law is open, and there are deputies, let them implead one another. And so, if the silversmiths and their guild have a legal issue against the Christians, then they can implead them, which means they can call them to court, right? Sue them. That's what he's saying there, verse 39 and 40. But if ye inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. For we are in danger to be called in question for this day's uproar, there being no cause whereby we may give an account of this concourse. Right? He says they haven't done anything unlawful. Their accusers haven't done that in a lawful assembly. They haven't taken them to court to make their complaint. They've just stirred up this riot, and they said, if this gets back to Caesar, we're all going to be in trouble, right? It's going to be a mess. Right? We'll have no excuse. We won't be able to defend our own actions. Verse 41, and when he had thus spoken, he dismissed the assembly. So he dismisses the crowd. They realize they're going to be in trouble, and so this man, this town clerk, he's not protecting Paul and the Christians. That's not what he's doing. He's not defending Christianity. He's not defending God there. He's just protecting the crowd. He's protecting his own city there from any kind of unlawful behavior. God's the one who's protecting Paul and these other men. He's the one doing that. And so, they're just patronizing Paul and the Christians. So just, go on, do your little thing, just leave us alone. We don't want people to patronize us, right? Because people that patronize us will just listen. You know how they are. They'll listen to you. You can tell it's having no effect on them whatsoever, and when you leave, nothing's changed. They don't feel convicted. They don't feel any need to change, need to repent. So, we don't want that. It's okay to ruffle some feathers once in a while, right? Some people are going to get mad. But at least the Holy Spirit is working on them. At least He's working on them. And God will take care of the rest from there. Any questions or comments this evening?